Ryan Hammonds. A 5-year-old boy in Oklahoma wakes up screaming. Night after night, the same nightmare. He clutches his chest. His parents assume it is the ordinary dark of childhood, the kind that fades by morning. Then he starts naming streets in a city he has never visited. He describes a house he has never seen. He looks at his hands and asks, with what his mother later described as genuine confusion, why he doesn't look the same anymore. His mother, Cindy, began writing it all down, not because she believed what she was hearing, but because the specificity unsettled her. Over 2 years, she filled a journal. Eventually, she contacted Jim Tucker, a child psychiatrist at the University of Virginia's Division of Perceptual Studies, who had spent 15 years studying cases exactly like this one. Tucker matched Ryan's memories to a man named Marty Martin, a minor Hollywood extra who died in 1952. Not a famous man. Not a man with a Wikipedia page or a biography on any shelf. An uncredited background performer whose life had left almost no public trace. What Ryan had said about him was this: the man had lived on a street with the word Rock in the name, verified as North Roxbury Drive in Beverly Hills. He had traveled to France, danced, and represented people for a living. Martin was confirmed to have worked as a Hollywood talent agent. He had a pool and a piano in his house, verified through records, and he had 5 children. That last detail is the one that stops you. When researchers first checked Martin's death certificate, it listed only 1 child. Tucker kept digging. Subsequent research confirmed 5 children across multiple relationships. Ryan had stated the number before the researchers knew it. In a formal investigation Tucker published in the peer-reviewed journal Explore in 2016, he documented 55 specific claims Ryan had made. 51 of them were verified. Then there is the physical dimension. Ryan's nightmares were not vague. They centered on his chest. He clutched it. He described distress localized specifically to his heart. Marty Martin died of a heart attack. The standard explanation for cases like this is cryptomnesia. The theory holds that Ryan absorbed fragments of information about Martin through overheard adult conversations, incidental television exposure, or background media he encountered without consciously registering it. Children are highly suggestible. The parent's own investment in the story and the researcher's confirmation bias may have shaped which memories were recorded, tested, and eventually published. These are fair points. Cryptomnesia is a real phenomenon, and it deserves to be taken seriously. But Marty Martin had no public profile. He had no accessible biography and no media footprint. His 5 children were not on his death certificate. That number was discovered by researchers only after Ryan stated it. The information did not exist in any form that a child could have stumbled across, which means cryptomnesia, in this case, requires a source that no one has been able to identify. Some researchers believe the specificity and volume of verified claims in Ryan's case exceed what chance or incidental exposure can explain. Tucker, who has studied over 2,500 cases of this kind, argues that if the relationship between consciousness and the brain is not as fixed as mainstream neuroscience assumes, a question that remains genuinely unresolved, then what Ryan experienced demands a mechanistic explanation rather than a dismissal. The question is not whether a 5-year-old is lying. The question is where the information about those 5 children came from, if not from a source that no one has yet been able to name. Why do the physical symptoms, the chest pain, the clutching, correspond precisely to Martin's cause of death? And why, across Tucker's entire archive of 2,500 cases, do roughly 70% involve violent or sudden death? What does that pattern mean? Across the Atlantic, decades earlier, a little girl in India was already drawing maps of a city she had supposedly never entered and asking her parents to take her home. Shanti Devi. She was 4 years old when she told her parents she had a husband, 3 children, and a home in a city called Mathura, 200 kilometers away. She gave her husband's full name. She gave her own previous name. She said she had died in childbirth and she wanted to go back. Her parents dismissed it. For years, they did what most parents would do: redirected, ignored, waited for it to pass. It didn't pass. Eventually, her teacher, acting on quiet curiosity, wrote a letter to a man in Mathura whose name and description matched Shanti's account exactly. The man, Kedarnath Chaubey, wrote back. His wife, Lukdi Devi, had died from complications following childbirth in 1925. The details matched. In 1936, a formal committee of 15 prominent citizens, including politicians and journalists, accompanied Shanti on a trip to Mathura to test her claims in a setting no one could later accuse of being staged. She had correctly named Kedarnath Chaubey as her previous husband and Lukdi Devi as her previous self, before any contact with Mathura had been made. She described Lukdi's death from childbirth complications consistent with family records. She described the interior layout of the Mathura house, including rooms that had been added after Lukdi's death. She noted the changes unprompted, not with recognition, but with mild surprise that things had been altered. The committee's carriage moved through unfamiliar streets. Shanti directed it without instruction. It stopped at the correct house. In a crowd, she identified Lukdi's parents without prior introduction and without any contextual cue. And then she named a location where Lukdi had hidden money. The money was gone. But Kedarnath, pressed by the committee, privately admitted he had removed it. Ian Stevenson, the psychiatrist who spent 40 years cataloging over 3,000 reincarnation-type cases at the University of Virginia, reviewed the original documentation of Shanti's case in the 1970s. The findings are held in the Indian National Archives. He considered it one of the most evidentially robust cases in his career-spanning archive, noting that the convergence of correct proper names, independently navigated geography, and a verified private financial detail created a cluster of corroboration that coincidence could not comfortably absorb. The mainstream explanation centers on cultural priming. In a society where reincarnation is accepted religious doctrine, children are embedded in a framework that encourages and rewards such narratives. Shanti may have absorbed geographic and family information about Mathura through Delhi's social networks and been gradually reinforced with adult attention and excitement for elaborating on it. The committee visit may have involved subtle unconscious cueing, and confirmation bias would naturally shape which correct answers were recorded and which misses were forgotten. But the hidden money. No cultural framework explains a child disclosing the specific concealed location of money that a widower removed after his wife's death, a detail he had shared with no one and admitted only after Shanti named it. Stevenson noted that the 1936 committee was not composed of believers. Several members entered the investigation explicitly skeptical. None of them, in the published record, could account for the money. What mechanism, supposedly operating across biological death, carries the memory of a hidden object to a child who was not yet born when it was concealed? Why did Shanti's detailed memories fade almost entirely by age 15, a pattern that appears across the majority of cases in Stevenson's global archive? And why does geographic navigation, the body finding its way through unknown streets, seem to be the single hardest element for skeptical explanations to absorb? Shanti knew where the money was hidden. Swarnlata Mishra knew something stranger. She knew songs that had never been written down, performed privately by a woman who died 20 years before Swarnlata was born. Swarnlata Mishra. There is no recording of the songs. There never was. they were private. Sung inside a family home in the city of Katni in central India. And when the woman who sang them died, they should have died with her. But around 1948, a 3-year-old girl in a village elsewhere in Madhya Pradesh began performing them. Elaborate dances, songs in a language her parents could not identify. She called them her own. She said she had learned them in her other life. Ian Stevenson investigated the case beginning in 1961, conducting structured interviews with the Mishra family and with surviving members of the Pathak family in Katni. His findings were published in his landmark 1966 study, one of the earliest academically rigorous investigations of children's past life claims to appear in formal psychological literature. Before any contact was made with the Pathak family, Swarnlata had made over 49 specific statements about her previous life as a woman named Bia Pathak. 43 of those statements were subsequently verified. She correctly described the layout of the Pathak family home, including a specific room and a veranda. She recognized Bia's husband and children in a staged meeting where Stevenson deliberately introduced decoys among the group. She was not misled by any of them. When Bia's husband tested her by denying he was her husband, she told him he was lying and named a specific private incident that only the two of them could have known. She identified Bia's former son without hesitation, a man who was now physically older than Swarnlata herself in her current life. And then the songs. Former friends of Bia Pathak were shown Swarnlata's performances with no prior context, no explanation, no leading questions. They identified the songs as authentic, as ones Bia had sung privately, songs that had never been publicly performed, songs that had never been recorded. Stevenson documented this finding and published it in 20 cases suggestive of reincarnation. The mainstream explanation holds that the geographic proximity of the two families within central India's social networks means information about Bia Pathak's life, including her musical habits, could plausibly have circulated and reached Swarnlata's family through indirect channels. Songs learned informally in early childhood are not always consciously remembered as learned. The recognition scenes, taking place in a culturally primed context, may have involved subtle adult cueing that shaped which moments were recorded as successes. But the songs were never recorded and were never publicly performed. For Swarnlata to have learned them through overheard conversation, someone in that chain had to have sung them. Someone who knew Bia Pathak's private repertoire had contact with Swarnlata's world, and after 50 years of scrutiny, that person has never been identified. Stevenson returned repeatedly to what he considered the most resistant element of this case. You cannot confirm something as authentic unless you already knew it existed. The Pathak family's recognition of those performances was not guided. By every account, it was surprise. What is the mechanism by which a specific, private, unrecorded musical memory moves from one person across a biological death and surfaces in the performing body of a child born 20 years later? Is there a meaningful difference between remembering a song and being able to sing it? Why does skill transfer, music and language, and physical ability appear more robust across cases in Stevenson's archive than factual biographical memory, which is both easier to verify and easier to acquire through information leakage? And why, in virtually every documented case across his entire archive, do the memories begin fading around age 7, precisely the developmental window when autobiographical memory consolidates? From the plains of central India to the west coast of Scotland, a 5-year-old boy is standing at the edge of the ocean, drawing pictures of a white house by the sea and asking his parents why they won't take him home to an island he has supposedly never visited. Cameron Macaulay. He drew the house before he could explain it. White walls, facing water, somewhere he called Barra. He told his mother his family there was bigger than their family in Glasgow. He described a father who was just always there, present in a way that seemed to carry specific emotional weight, not the vague contentment of imagination, but the particular quality of a described memory. He said his name used to be Cameron. He said the people on Barra didn't know where he had gone. His mother, Norma, eventually contacted the University of Virginia's Division of Perceptual Studies. Jim Tucker and a BBC documentary team accompanied the family to the island of Barra in 2005. Cameron had genuinely never been there. His behavior on the island was filmed without prior rehearsal. Before the visit, Cameron had described a white house with 3 toilets on the ground floor facing the sea. That is not the kind of architectural detail that appears in tourism brochures. It is specific, structural, and peculiar enough that it demands attention. It was verified. He had described his previous father as Shane Robertson, killed by a car. Records confirmed that a Robertson family had lived in a house matching Cameron's description and that the father's cause of death aligned with what Cameron had said. He described looking out at a specific landing beach where planes arrived, a correct geographic detail of the location he identified. He described specific rooms and the views from them, details verified by family records on arrival. On the island itself, Cameron navigated unfamiliar landscape with what witnesses and camera footage described as visible confidence. He expressed emotional distress about the Robertson father's death that his current family described as disproportionate, persistent, and entirely without a source in his present life. Tucker included the case in his 2013 book Return to Life, noting it among the geographically verified cases with the highest architectural specificity in his archive. The mainstream explanation is reasonable on its face. Barra is not obscure. It appears in Scottish tourism material, documentary programming, and geographic education. A child with a vivid imagination could absorb images of island architecture through media, assemble them into a consistent fantasy, and elaborate on it over time. Confirmation bias during the island visit would naturally emphasize matches and minimize misses, but the 3 ground floor toilets, that specific, structural, unglamorous architectural detail does not appear in any tourism material about Barra. It is not the kind of thing a child invents as part of a romantic island fantasy, and it was correct. Some researchers believe Cameron's case is notable precisely because the memory is architectural rather than biographical. He did not construct an elaborate personal history. He described a building. At what point, some ask, does imagination that is consistently and specifically correct become indistinguishable from memory? If we cannot tell the difference, what does that mean for the way we understand where children's interior worlds come from? Why did Cameron's distress center on the Robertson father's death, a detail too specific for any accessible source? Why did his memories begin fading almost immediately after the visit to Barra, as if the purpose of remembering had somehow been discharged? And we may never know, but it is worth sitting with this. What did the 5-year-old boy think he was going home to find? Cameron remembered a house. Dorothy Eady remembered an entire civilization, and she spent 50 years producing archaeological knowledge about it that professional Egyptologists could not explain away. Dorothy Eady. A 3-year-old girl in London fell down a flight of stairs in 1907. The attending doctor pronounced her dead. When she recovered consciousness, she was, by every account of those who knew her before and after, a different child. She became inconsolable in ways that resisted explanation. She told her parents she wanted to go home. She did not mean the house she was in. She described temples. She described columns and incense and a particular quality of light falling on stone. She meant ancient Egypt, and she would spend the next 70 years demonstrating, with a specificity that unsettled the professional archaeologists who worked alongside her that she had been there. Dorothy eventually emigrated to Egypt, adopted the name Sidi, and was employed as a researcher by the Egyptian Department of Antiquities at Abydos, where she worked alongside credentialed scholars who documented her anomalous knowledge on the institutional record. She identified herself as a temple priestess from the reign of Pharaoh Seti I, circa 1290 BCE. She described specific details of daily ritual sequence in that temple, including liturgical details that matched unpublished papyri held at European institutions she had no documented access to. She described the private habits and living quarters of Seti I himself, details later corroborated by ongoing excavation. She translated and interpreted hieroglyphic texts in ways that senior Egyptologists initially challenged and later accepted as correct. She collaborated formally with the archaeologist Ahmed Fakhri. Jonathan Cott's 1987 biography, The Search for Seti, documents corroborating testimonies from multiple professional Egyptologists who verified her anomalous knowledge on the record. Then there is the garden. Dorothy guided Egyptologists to the location of a buried garden at Abydos that no published map or excavation record had documented. They dug where she pointed. The garden was there. The mainstream explanation acknowledges that Dorothy Eady was a self-taught obsessive who spent decades absorbing everything available about ancient Egypt, academic papers, museum collections, privately circulated scholarly manuscripts, and informal conversations with Egyptologists in Cairo's scholarly community. The details she supposedly revealed may have come from unpublished papers she accessed without formal documentation, and from the privileged daily access she earned through years of immersion at Abydos itself. But a location in the ground is not a theory. It is not an interpretation of a text or a reconstruction of a ritual. Either Dorothy pointed to an unmarked place and the excavation found what she said was there, or she didn't. The record says she did. No amount of scholarly reading produces knowledge of where an unexcavated garden is buried. What separates Dorothy's case structurally from every childhood case in this list is duration and utility. She did not remember a past life at 4 and forget it at 8. She maintained it across 7 decades, and the knowledge she produced was accurate enough that working archaeologists built on it. Whether or not one accepts any metaphysical frame, the information was real. So what was she accessing? How did she know where the garden was? Why did her ritual knowledge match unpublished papyri she had no documented path to? And is there a meaningful difference between a woman who remembered living in ancient Egypt and a woman who, for reasons no one has explained, simply knew more about it than almost anyone alive? Dorothy's knowledge of ancient Egypt took a lifetime to document. James Leininger was 2 years old, and he was already screaming the full name of a dead pilot he had supposedly never heard of. James Leininger. The nightmares began before he had the language to describe them clearly. A 2-year-old boy in Louisiana, waking in distress, saying the plane was on fire, saying it couldn't get out. His parents started keeping a journal in 1998. His father, Bruce, an evangelical Christian with no prior belief in reincarnation, spent years attempting to disprove what his son was saying. He could not. James named the ship his plane had launched from as Natoma. It was the USS Natoma Bay, a small escort carrier not covered in popular military history, not the subject of children's books or mainstream documentaries. He named a fellow pilot as Jack Larson. Larson was located alive. He confirmed he had served on the Natoma Bay alongside a pilot named James Houston, Jr. James had said the pilot he remembered being was named James. The identified pilot was James M. Houston, Jr. James described Houston's plane being struck in the engine and going down at the front of the aircraft. Combat records subsequently located were consistent with that description. From the age of 2, James made drawings of fighter planes with accurate details of World War II-era aircraft markings, details not present in standard children's books. He named 3 G.I. Joe action figures after Natoma Bay pilots killed in action, names traceable only through archival unit records, not through any popular history of the vessel. At a Natoma Bay Veterans reunion, James met Jack Larson in person. Larson confirmed specific details James had mentioned. The reactions of surviving crew members to that encounter are documented in the Leininger family's published account, Sole Survivor, which appeared in 2009. Jim Tucker examined the case and included it in his 2013 book, Return to Life, noting the convergence of a named ship, a named colleague, a named casualty, a confirmed method of death, and a living corroborating witness. The mainstream explanation holds that military history is broadly accessible, including operational records of World War II escort carriers through documentaries, veterans organizations, and published histories. James's father, deeply engaged with his son's distress, may have unconsciously introduced information through picture books, films, or conversations that James absorbed and incorporated into his nightmares. The identification of Larson and Natoma could reflect a child organizing overheard fragments into a coherent narrative over time. But the G.I. Joe figures named after dead Natoma Bay pilots. Those names do not appear in any popular history of the vessel. They are traceable only through archival unit records. A 2-year-old does not search military archives. Tucker argues the Leininger case is structurally distinct within his archive because of the living witness. Jack Larson was findable. He remembered Houston. He confirmed what the child knew. This is not built solely on parental interpretation. It is partly built on the testimony of a World War II veteran who recognized what a small child described. Why do James's nightmares follow the clinical pattern of traumatic re-experiencing more closely than the pattern of childhood fantasy? Why did they stop permanently after the family located Houston's sister and held a small ceremony of acknowledgement as if something had been completed? And across Tucker's entire archive, roughly 70% of children's past life claims involve violent or sudden death. That pattern appears in the data regardless of culture or geography. We may never know what it means. James's memories were violent, and they found their confirmation in a living witness. Nanatilaka's were geographic, and she confirmed them by walking through a city she had never been told existed. Nanatilaka. She was 4 years old, and she wanted her other parents. She named them. She named the city Kataragama. She described a father who sold flowers at a temple, a specific occupation in a specific place. When researchers eventually took her there, she didn't wait to be shown the way. Nanatilaka's case was investigated by Ian Stevenson beginning in 1961 and published in his foundational 1966 study, 20 Cases Suggestive of Reincarnation, one of the first academically rigorous investigations of children's past life claims to appear in formal psychological literature. The case predates the standardized protocols Stevenson would later develop, making it among the earliest documented investigations of this kind. Before any contact was made with the family she described, Nanatilaka had named Tilakaratne as the girl she had been and described that girl's father as a flower seller at the Kataragama Temple, a specific occupation verified on investigation. She correctly described the layout of the Tilakaratne family home before arriving at it. She recognized Tilakaratne's father in a group of strangers, moving directly toward him without prompting or contextual cueing. She identified personal objects belonging to Tilikarotny from among others presented to her in a non-directed setting. She described the cause of Tilikarotny's death, which the family confirmed. Stevenson noted that the geographic distance between Gananatalaka's home village and Kataragama reduced the probability of casual information exchange through overlapping social networks. His formal documentation was published through the American Society for Psychical Research, making it one of the most systematically recorded early cases in the field. The mainstream explanation is coherent. Kataragama is one of Sri Lanka's most famous pilgrimage sites, extensively described in religious literature and visited by families across the island. Sri Lanka's Buddhist cultural framework treats rebirth as factual, creating strong incentive for children to develop past life narratives and for adults to seek confirming matches. The recognition scenes may have involved subtle, unconscious cueing from adults present during the investigation. But Kataragama's fame does not explain how a 4-year-old knew the specific occupation of a specific deceased man's father before she arrived. Temple tourism literature does not catalog individual flower vendors by family name. Stevenson's methodology in this case was unusually careful for its era. He documented the full sequence of claims made before any contact with the Tilikarotny family and the full sequence of verification afterward. His conclusion was not that reincarnation had been demonstrated, but that the convergence of specific verified details created an evidentiary cluster that demanded a serious mechanistic explanation, one that neither fraud nor cultural expectation nor coincidence adequately provided. Why does physical navigation, the body finding its way through unfamiliar geography, appear consistently as the hardest element for skeptical explanations to absorb, not just in this case, but across Stevenson's Sri Lankan archive? Why do the memories reliably fade at the same developmental window across cases collected on different continents, in different cultures, with different researchers? And is there a name for what Gnanatilaka knew, something that was not quite knowledge, and not quite invention, and not quite anything else we have a word for? From Sri Lanka's temples, we travel north to the jungles of Upper Burma, where a little girl refuses to wear dresses, weeps when aircraft fly overhead, and insists she died as a Japanese soldier who only wanted to go home to Japan. Ma Tin Aung Myo. She was born in 1953 in the village of Nathul in Upper Burma, and from the beginning she was wrong by the measure of everything around her. She refused traditional Burmese dress. She refused curried food. She expressed a preference for food she described as Japanese in a village that had no access to Japanese cuisine. And when Japanese aircraft flew over, she wept. Not with the vague distress of a sensitive child. With a specific targeted grief that had no origin in her current life. Ian Stevenson investigated her case in multiple visits beginning in the late 1960s and published it in his Cases of the Reincarnation Type, Volume 1, in 1977. He made return visits across several years specifically to test whether the behavioral patterns were consistent or shifting. They were consistent. She described dying from a gunshot wound to the groin while cooking over an outdoor fire, struck by fire from a low-flying aircraft. She described being stationed in the Nathul area during the war, a historically accurate detail, as Japanese forces occupied the region during World War II. Her memories remained detailed and internally consistent across years of interviews, which Stevenson noted as distinctive even within his archive of over 3,000 cases. She referred to her female body as a circumstance of error. She spoke of Japan as home until late adulthood. She never abandoned either position. The mainstream explanation is reasonable. Burma was occupied by Japanese forces, and stories of Japanese soldiers circulated widely in Burmese communities, particularly in areas of occupation like Nathul. A child growing up in this environment could have constructed a cross-gender identification narrative. The preference for male dress may reflect individual temperament or social contrarianism rather than anything like memory. But the weeping at aircraft. That is not a narrative. A narrative can be constructed from overheard stories. An involuntary emotional response to a specific external stimulus documented on separate visits across multiple years by an independent researcher is a different category of evidence entirely. Stevenson witnessed it himself. He documented it. It was not performed for his benefit. It happened when the planes flew over, regardless of who was watching. Ma Tin Aung Myo's case is unusual within Stevenson's archive because the claimed previous identity was never specifically matched to a named individual. No particular Japanese soldier was identified as the source. What remains is behavioral and physiological evidence without biographical corroboration, and Stevenson argued this made it in some ways more compelling, not less. The behaviors are not constructed around a confirmed match. They precede one. The aircraft response is the datum. Everything else is interpretation. So what produced it? Why does the response persist across decades long after biographical memories have faded, following the clinical pattern of traumatic conditioning rather than narrative recall? And what is Ma Tin Aung Myo homesick for, in a country she has never visited, in a body she says was never supposed to be hers? Ma Tin Aung Myo mourned a country she had never visited. The Pollock twins, born in England, seemed to mourn each other, and they did it before anyone had told them there was someone to mourn. The Pollock twins. In May of 1957, two little girls named Joanna and Jacqueline Pollock were struck and killed by a car in Hexham, Northumberland. Their father, John, was a devout Catholic who believed in reincarnation, a position that put him at odds with his own church. In the aftermath of his daughter's deaths, he told his wife they would come back. Multiple witnesses would later confirm he said this before any subsequent pregnancy was known. Less than a year later, twin girls were born. One of them had birthmarks in exactly the same locations as wounds carried by her dead sister. Ian Stevenson investigated the case and published it in his 1987 monograph, Children Who Remember Previous Lives. Jennifer, the younger twin by 10 minutes, was born with two marks that corresponded precisely to Jacqueline's. A birthmark on the same hip, in the same shape and pigmentation, and a thin mark on the forehead matching the exact location of a scar Jacqueline had sustained in a bicycle accident, a scar documented in medical records that predated the twins' conception. Both marks were documented medically at birth, before any claims about identity had been made by the parents. When the family returned to Hexham, which the twins had never visited, Jillian and Jennifer recognized specific locations, including their previous school and a playground, navigating toward them without instruction. They asked for toys belonging to the deceased girls by name, including a specific doll named Mary, before being shown any photographs of the original girls. They displayed an intense and specific fear of cars passing at close range, a phobia with no apparent source in their current experience, which receded around age 5. And Jillian, at one point, held Jennifer's head in her hands and said, "The blood's coming out of your eyes." Those who heard it connected the statement to the nature of Jacqueline's injuries in the accident. John Pollock's prior public prediction of the twins' return, made before the pregnancy, was corroborated by multiple independent witnesses documented in Stevenson's monograph. The mainstream explanation is worth taking seriously. The Pollock parents were deeply invested in a reincarnation narrative before the twins were born. A father who had publicly predicted his daughter's return would have unconsciously shaped the twins' environment from infancy, showing them the dead girls' toys, speaking their names, returning to Hexham in ways that primed recognition. The birthmarks may represent coincidence. selectively matched to the deceased girl's physical marks after birth in the context of a family primed to find confirmation. But the forehead mark was documented in Jacqueline's medical records before the twins were born. If Jennifer's corresponding mark matches it in location and morphology, that match either preceded any coaching or coaching shapes the embryonic development of birthmarks. That is not a biological mechanism that has ever been proposed. Stevenson spent the latter decades of his career collecting birthmark cases specifically because he considered them the most evidentially robust element in the reincarnation literature, a physical claim that precedes any verbal narrative and cannot be explained by suggestion or bias. He published 225 such cases in his 1997 monograph, Reincarnation and Biology. Why do the behavioral memories, the car phobia, the toy recognition, the geographic navigation fade by age 5 following the same developmental pattern as Stevenson's global archive, while the physical marks do not fade at all? Why did Gillian hold Jennifer's head and describe the wound? And is John Pollock's prior prediction evidence of something genuinely anomalous or the behavior of a grieving father who framed a coincidental twin pregnancy as fulfillment and happened to be right about the birthmarks? The Pollock twins carried the marks on their skin. Purnima Ekanayake carried something harder to explain. She remembered a man she had never met who made incense, and she identified his brand by smell before anyone took her to his family. Purnima Ekanayake. She was 2 years old when she told her parents she had another family. She said her father made incense near a large white temple. She named the temple. She said she had been a man in her previous life. She said she had been struck by a bus. And before anyone arranged a visit, before any contact was made with any family, researchers handed Purnima several different brands of incense and asked her to smell them. She selected the correct one. Purnima's case was investigated by Erlendur Haraldsson of the University of Iceland, one of Ian Stevenson's primary research collaborators, and published in the Journal of the Society for Psychical Research in 2000. Jim Tucker subsequently examined it as part of his broader survey of the field. It is notable within the academic literature for a specific reason. The sensory identification test was conducted before the subject visited the identified family, which means the result cannot have been shaped by the recognition scenes that followed it. Purnima had described her previous family as living near the Kelaniya Raja Mahaviharaya, a large and specific Buddhist temple in Kelaniya. Verified as geographically accurate, she described her previous father as manufacturing a specific incense brand called Ambiga, sold near the temple. The Pereira family produced exactly that brand. In the smell test conducted by Haraldsson's team, she identified the Ambiga brand from among others without visual cues. She described dying after being struck by a bus. Jinnadasa Pereira had been killed by a bus, confirmed by family records. She described specific physical details of the Pereira home on arrival, verified by family members. She recognized members of the Pereira family in a staged encounter without prompting. Haraldsson's formal investigation documented 30 specific statements made before contact with the Pereira family. 25 of them were subsequently verified. That is a corroboration rate of 83%, published in a peer-reviewed journal. The mainstream explanation has weight. Kelaniya and its famous temple are widely known across Sri Lanka, extensively described in religious and tourism contexts. The Ambiga incense brand, sold commercially at a prominent temple, would be visible to any visitor to the area. Information about Jinnadasa Pereira's death may have circulated through the regional social network accessible to Purnima's family through indirect connections that were never fully traced. But the smell test. Purnima did not identify a label or a name or a location on a map. She identified a scent before she was taken anywhere, before she met anyone from the Pereira family, before any confirmation was attempted. Either she correctly identified that specific incense by olfactory recognition, or she didn't. Olfactory memory is not a narrative. It cannot be coached into existence. According to Haraldson's published record, she was correct. Some researchers believe Purnima's case sits at the intersection of two things that are genuinely difficult to explain simultaneously: a sensory identification that precedes any biographical corroboration and cannot be shaped by suggestion, combined with a volume of verified statements that meets the statistical threshold Haraldson and Stevenson established across their broader research programs. The question the case leaves open is not whether a 2-year-old girl is deceiving anyone. The question is this: how does a child develop specific olfactory familiarity with an incense brand produced by a family she has supposedly never encountered, in a town she has never visited, connected to a man who died before she was born? Why do Haraldson's Sri Lankan cases consistently show higher verification rates than equivalent Western cases? And across all 10 of the people in this list, from Ryan in Oklahoma to Purnima in Kelaniya, why does the same pattern emerge and dissolve? Vivid, specific, verifiable memories arriving before age 5, fading before age 8, leaving behind only the marks and the smells, and the involuntary grief when the aircraft flies over. Pull back now. 10 people, 7 countries. 50 years of documented academic investigation spanning the University of Virginia, the University of Iceland, and the American Society for Psychical Research. What connects them is not a shared culture or a shared religion. What connects them is structure. A child under the age of 5 begins producing specific, verifiable, and often private information about a deceased person they have no documented connection to. The memories arrive with emotional weight and physical correlates. They are tested, and a significant proportion of them check out. Then somewhere between the ages of 5 and 8, they fade. The child grows up. The memories go quiet. What remains in some cases are marks on the body, and in others, an involuntary response to a sound or a smell that bypasses language entirely and cannot be reasoned away. The mainstream view deserves to be stated fairly, because it is not unreasonable. Children are suggestible. Grieving parents find patterns. Researchers have blind spots, particularly researchers who have spent their careers hoping a phenomenon is real. Cultural frameworks that normalize rebirth produce children who perform rebirth. Confirmation bias shapes which correct answers get recorded and which misses get quietly set aside. Every one of those points is true, and none of them explains the hidden money. None of them explains the 5 children whose names were not on the death certificate. None of them explains what Purnima smelled before anyone took her anywhere. None of them explains why a birthmark appeared on a forehead in the precise location documented in a dead child's medical record. The alternative view, that something we do not yet have a mechanism for carries specific experiential information across biological death, is not a comfortable position. It requires revising assumptions about the nature of consciousness that most of science has not been willing to examine seriously. It is not proven. Ian Stevenson himself never claimed it was. What he claimed consistently and carefully across 4 decades of work was that the evidence created a problem that the existing explanations did not solve. Tucker says the same thing. Haraldson says the same thing. These are not credulous men. They are researchers who followed the evidence and reported honestly on where it left them. That gap between what the evidence seems to demand and what the current theory allows is where these 10 people live. Most people walk through that gap, reach for the nearest explanation, and move on. But you watch to the end. which means you already know that some questions are more important than their answers. Go to the comments and tell us, which one of these cases do you think is the hardest to explain away? Build the argument, make the case. And if this is the kind of question you want to keep asking, subscribe. This is where people like you come to think. 10 people remembered lives they were never supposed to have lived. A boy in Oklahoma clutched his chest in the dark and named a man no one was supposed to remember. A woman in Egypt pointed to the ground and said, "Dig here." A child in Sri Lanka picked up a stick of incense and knew, in the part of her that predated language, that she had smelled it before. The memories always faded. That may be the most unsettling detail of all. Something new. And then it forgot. Then for a few years, it remembered. The strangest part is not what they knew. It is how certain they were